Over his time here, which is more than 30 years, he served as head of the Department of Social Sciences, as well as the Deputy Dean of School of Human and Environmental Sciences. Professor Billig is a social psychologist by formation, so this is psychology is one of the disciplines represented here and also in our network. But his work exerted influence well beyond the boundaries of his discipline, social psychology. Over the years, his research interests have ranged over a number of different topics, and I'll only mention a few: social psychological theory, fascism, psychoanalysis, academic racism, humor, rhetoric, the current state of writing in the social sciences, one of my favorites, where he looked at why academic social scientists write badly. If you're intrigued, do read. It's one of his recent books. And of course, also nationalism. His most widely cited book, Banal Nationalism, published in 1995, redefined the way we think about nationalism. I think it's fair to say that. Drawing attention to the importance of what he called the unwaved flags. That is, the barely noticeable, the taken for granted little reminders of national belonging and the national divisions in the world. And yet, he pointed out that these little reminders are actually what sustain the power and the appeal of nationalism, even in times when nationalism appears to be of little importance, appears almost to be withering away. And sadly, the developments of recent years have, I believe, vindicated his arguments, because nationalism returned with a vengeance as a powerful political, cultural, and social force, seemingly out of nowhere for some people, but not, I would say, for those who have read Billig's work, and reappeared even in countries where the appeal of nationalism has long been forgotten or at least dismissed. We are therefore very, very grateful to Billig for accepting this invitation to deliver the opening keynote, which is entitled Banal Nationalism and Banal Internationalism. Mick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk here. And it's a great pleasure to be talking again at Loughborough University, where I worked for many years and worked here very happily. It was a lovely place to work. The old Department of Social Sciences, which in the interest of modernity had to be closed down. I want to start with an apology. You are all experts and specialists in the study of nationalism. For a brief period, I could have called myself that, but I no longer feel myself an expert on nationalism. I haven't been asked to talk today because I've got some new data to share with you or some new ideas about nationalism. No, it's because I wrote a book nearly 30 years ago, and since then my attention's turned elsewhere. I'm at the moment working for political manipulation statistics. I'd like to talk about that, really, but I know that's not why you've asked me, and it would be self-indulgent to talk about it, although I'll mention one thing later on about it. So I should talk about my very old book and the background to it, which is also self-indulgent, but not quite as self-indulgent. You may ask, why didn't I stay with the study of nationalism? I think it's a personal failing. I have a low threshold for boredom. Do one thing, and then I want to do something else. I just don't want to stay with it. In many respects, I wish I had. I wish I'd been more like Anthony Smith, whose great contribution to the study of nationalism, and the establishment of the study of nationalism in Britain, I'm sure is well known to everyone in this room. He is someone who dug deeper and deeper into the study of nationalism, not like me, who rushes in and then rushes off. I wouldn't recommend what I've done to anyone else, because that's not the way that big insights really come from. A number of years ago, Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, distinguished between two sorts of acronyms: foxes and hedgehogs. Now, a fox knows many things, he said, but a hedgehog knows one big thing. And Anthony Smith knew one big thing. If only he were here today, I'm sure he would have much to say about the current war in Ukraine. We have to manage without him now. Am I a fox? I certainly don't know a big thing. As for lots of little things, well, I've forgotten lots. I'm a bit of a fraud standing here, because not only am I not an expert in the study of nationalism, I'm not even an expert on my book, which I wrote 30 years ago. This was brought home to me a few years ago when a French edition was published under the direction of Sophie Duchesne, who's an expert on social scientific methodology and on nationalism. And I realised, because she wrote the introduction, that she knew more about that book than I did. Because having written it, I don't go and read it. I don't every night take out another chapter, read another chapter and say, oh, isn't that wonderful, isn't it wonderful? I don't do that at all. And I've forgotten what was in it. I still have forgotten quite a bit of what's in it. But owing to Sophie Duchesne, I've been reminded of some of the things in it, and I wouldn't be able to talk in the way in which I'm going to if it hadn't been for her. Now, my background is in social psychology. My teacher in social psychology was the great social psychologist Henri Tucheville, and I was really fortunate to have him as my supervisor. And Henri Tucheville is notable throughout the social sciences for being the founder of what's called social identity theory. And social identity theory, like most theories in social psychology, is a universal theory, inasmuch as that it applies to all peoples whenever or wherever they live. The theory is a theory about the psychological force, of the psychological function of identities. And it's assumed that everyone has identities. Whatever historical period people have lived in, they've had identities. And social identity theory tends to assume that all identities have both universal cognitive functions, and above all, universal emotional functions, but everyone wants a positive identity, and that an identity, whether it's a national identity, whether it's an identity with a class or a profession, whether it's an identity in the academic world, oh, I study nationalism and ethnicity, or I am a sociologist, or I am an engineer, or whatever, gives you some value, and it divides you from people who have other identities. This is a universal assumption, and it's one which I used in my PhD, which but the limits of that assumption of the universality of the functions of identities, and therefore the real essence of identities, you need to strip away their particularities to look at what's underneath them. The limits of that struck me when I started studying the extreme right in Britain after I'd done my PhD. Most social psychologists at that time thought that people were drawn to extremist politics by their personality characteristics, and particularly whether they were authoritarian in personality or not authoritarians. This was the assumption of a very notable book, which was written many, many years ago, called The Authoritarian Personality. And it is assumed that you'll find authoritarians and non-authoritarians in every culture. In every culture there are those who are intolerant to ambiguity and must have clear distinctions, and these are the potential political experiences. And it's there in this book called The Authoritarian Personality, except for the sections written by the great Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno, because his work, his arguments in that book go against the general prevailing use of the book by social psychologists, because he said the authoritarianism behind fascism is actually historically created. You wouldn't get fascism in other historical periods. And it struck me when I was studying the fascists, the strange people in Britain who were drawn to fascism at that time, but this is so true. But just saying, oh, fascism gives them an identity is not enough. You have to look at the historical particularity. Why now, here, at this time, in this place, people are getting something out of being members of an extreme organisation. And this view became stronger with me when I did some research on the British monarchy. Because I found that people in Britain said some bizarre things about why they love the monarchy. They said, we need the monarchy. The monarchy is great. All other countries in the world, they envy us for having the Queen. They envy us for having a really good royal family. Even those who have their own royal families, they envy us. And it struck me that these were nationalist beliefs. These weren't just beliefs of the wonders of the Queen, her children, and her children's children. These were beliefs about the world, about what nationhood was, and about how our nationhood is actually much better than envied by other nations, the uniqueness of us. And that brought home to me how ignorant I was about nationalism, where it comes from, and how it operates. And so I started reading about nationalism. And like many people in the 1990s, I was drawn to two particular books, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities and Ernest Gellner's Nations and Nationalism. And they were like a revelation to me, because in these books I found a sense of history, the historical perspective on identities, on the psychological these really were part of the modern world. We might have had ethnic identities in the Roman Empire, a sense of belonging to the empire or not belonging to the empire. But these were national identities as such as we understand them today, because national identities are strongly related to the creation of the nation state. And there haven't always been nation states in the world. The nation state properly belongs to the modern era. A nation state has tight boundaries. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, kingdoms didn't have tight boundaries. One kingdom merged into another kingdom. Nation states have official languages, and the languages have tight boundaries. In the Middle Ages, one language or one dialect, one way of talking seemed to merge into another way of talking, and there wasn't this obsession with teaching proper French or teaching proper Italian or teaching proper English. Most people didn't have a name for the language they spoke, they just spoke. And in the Middle Ages, identities, commitments were arranged more hierarchically. You committed yourself to your local lord, and the local lord committed themselves to the higher aristocracy and then working up to the king, not horizontally. And so, to create nation states, according to Gellner and Benedict Anderson particularly, you need to create not just the political structures of the nation state, but also the myths of where we have come from, and why we are special, and why we are different. You see, in the Middle Ages, states didn't have the boundaries, they didn't have recognised educational curricula, they didn't have citizens as such, and they didn't collect statistics about their citizens. I said I was going to mention statistics, but the word statistics itself illustrates something new happened in the age of the nation state. The word statistics really came into the English language at the end of the 18th century, came in via French and German, which have been slightly further advanced. But the word statistics, just think of it, we're so used to it, we don't notice it. It's not, doesn't contain the word number. It's not numeristics, it's statistics. Because originally statistics in the 18th century stood for the information a state needs about itself and its inhabitants. It comes from the Latin status, meaning a state. And it was because so much of the information was numerical that the word statistics came to stand for numbers, even though it originally didn't. It included all information of the state about itself. An example of how the assumptions of the nation state permeate not just our way of life, but also the language we use. Now, as I read Anderson, Gellner, and other experts on nationalism, I started to wonder whether they were missing out something. Was there a gap in their analysis? Sometimes it's easier to read things on your own, because I was reading on my own, I was part of a group. Marco hadn't yet come to Loughborough at that time and founded the Loughborough University group. I was just on my own, and when you read on your own, you have an advantage. There's no one saying to you, "Oh, don't be silly. Of course these are great books. Don't be silly. Of course I don't miss anything out. Just get on and understand them." But sometimes you can stray off piece, as it were, if you're isolated from groups. Now, Gellner and Anderson and others were studying historically how nation states were created and how the first nation states particularly came into being. They were also pointing out that there's unsuccessful nationalisms. It's not enough just to imagine the community. You have to put that imagination into practice. And there's always been failed nationalisms. Today, you have nationalists in Brittany who failed to create a brand national state, or in Catalonia, or in Sardinia, or the Kurds, or the Palestinians. Now, there was also seemed to me a terminological thing. You see, Gellner and Anderson were talking about how nations are created, rather than how they're reproduced once they've been created, how they're reproduced every day, day after day. What is necessary for the reproduction of established nation states, so that they almost can be taken for granted. Now, ideology has many different meanings, but one of the most important meanings, in my view, for the social sciences, is ideology stands for the beliefs, the practices, the turns of phrase, the language, which makes historically created structures appear as if they're natural, as if they must exist, not that they have been created and therefore can be uncreated. And the majority of students of nationalism haven't got a word for describing what may be the ideological processes by which nations are reproduced. It's not magic or smoke or mirrors, but it must be something else. And it's as if there was a gap, both in academic language and in ordinary language. It's not just a matter of nationalism, but it's also a gap in the vocabulary of the use of the word nationalist. According to most historians and social scientists and ordinary people, nationalists are the people who create nations. They're people who have put into political action movements which lead to Italy being created, or Germany, and so on. It's also then applied to those politicians who wished to make the nation or the race the centre of the politics of their established nation. But we can call Trump a nationalist, Netanyahu a nationalist, Erdogan a nationalist. And when we call them nationalists, we're not usually praising them. We say there's something too extreme about their politics. But it seems to me that it's not just a conceptual or theoretical problem. There's a political problem. What do you call the governments of each nation who will do everything they can to preserve or expand the existing boundaries of the nation state? Most nations today, or many nations, have been faced with secessionist movements, with part of the nation saying, we want our own nation state. Spain, the Basque and Catalans. The United Kingdom, with the Republicans in Northern Ireland, with Scottish nationalists, with Welsh nationalists who want their own Welsh state, nation state, or Scottish national states. It's as if the nationalists are those who want to change the map of the world of nation states. No one calls, or very few people call the prime ministers of the United Kingdom who say they are unionists. We don't support the nationalists. We want Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. No one calls them nationalists. It's as if it's entirely natural that the ministers of existing nations want to keep the existing nation and don't want it to be fragmented. And when I was writing Banal Nationalism, the conflict in Northern Ireland was raging. The Irish nationalists wanted Northern Ireland to be united with the Republic of Ireland south of the border. They wanted the border to disappear. And because they wished to change the existing state, they were called nationalists. No one was calling Margaret Thatcher a nationalist because she was opposing their nationalism. She was being called a defender of the United Kingdom, and she certainly called herself that. And the conflict was a violent conflict. Bombs going off, people being murdered, being shot at. But the violence wasn't all on one side. The British government liked to portray itself as just reacting to try and stop the violence of the Irish nationalists. Wasn't that clear at all? Because some of the conflict was actually started by the British troops in Ireland, the bloody Sunday shootings. But even if the violence, there was an equality on both sides, reacting to each other's violence and causing violence, there wasn't a linguistic equality. The nationalists were those. And what was Thatcher? What was the British government? Oh, it was as if it was quite natural for them to defend the boundaries of the existing state. This is, of course, before the Good Friday Agreement, which in effect got rid of the force of the boundary dividing the island of Ireland. But according to the Unionists, not the Nationalists, the Unionists in Northern Ireland, that put a boundary So it seemed to me in the Irish problem, the Northern Irish problem, I should say, the Northern Irish crises, war, there was a war between two nationalisms, one which was recognised and the other seemed to be hidden in plain sight. There's a similar issue in the United States. There's a terminological distinction which exists to this day, which is in both academic writing and in ordinary language, between nationalists and patriots, between nationalism and patriotism. And most Americans will say, we are patriots, and they, the nationalists, are others. Whether they're black nationalists or white nationalists, they're very different from us, who are the patriots. And it seems to me this is a political distinction rather than an analytic distinction. At the moment, it's said that nationalism has returned to the United States. And it returned with a force with Trump. And Trump is often called a white nationalist because he's clearly given his support to some extreme movements and some extreme policies. And his big slogan when he became president was, "Make America Great Again." This slogan was a nationalist slogan, so he said. But if you compare his rhetoric with the rhetoric of the Democratic president who came before him and the Democratic president who came after him, it's not vastly different. It's not like it's a totally different rhetoric. Obama, in his first inaugural speech after being elected as president, spoke about this great nation of ours. And what makes us a great nation is that we work together, and he listed several things which made America great. And Biden, when he came to power, when he was elected, he said, this is good because America would now lead the world again. Now, what is the difference, rhetorically, but not politically, between saying we must make America great again and saying America is great, is so great that it will be able to lead the world? This, in my view, the assumption of American greatness, which is almost taken for granted that any American politician should say, what a great nation we are. The assumption of American greatness makes possible a president like Trump. It's not the other way round, but Trumpism creates the assumption of American greatness. So I wanted to, at the time I was writing Banal Nationalism, to widen the use of the word nationalism and to look at the banal aspects of nationalism that the President of the United States always now has attached to their clothing and leading politicians a flag. They carry round with themselves the flag of the United States. And there's a further point, which I think I should stress more in my banal language, is that nationalism is now an international ideology. But nationalism is not just the attachment to a particular nation, to America, or to Ireland, or to Spain, or to Argentina, or whatever, to this particular nation, and an imagining that our particular nation is so different from all the other nations. Look, we have a wonderful royal family, everyone admires our royal family, so we're so different from all other nations. Well, we're not, because all nations imagine themselves to be unique, to occupy a unique part of the world, to have something unique, have a unique flag, have a unique anthem, have a unique history. In other words, the sense of uniqueness is itself general and makes each nation like another nation. And in this respect, it's important because nationalism is not just a belief about this nation, it's a belief about nations in general. If you think about what a nation is saying, or the members of a nation which has no nation state and wishes to become an independent nation, what the nationalists in Wales, in Scotland, in Palestine, the Kurds, what they're saying all the time is we deserve a nation state because in essence we are just like the nations which are established, and we are like the nations which oppose us being a nation state. There's nothing totally unique about the ideology or the beliefs of those nationalists who say we must have a nation state, we deserve it. And so nationalism is not just about a belief and practices about this nation, that nation. It's the beliefs about the world itself, a world of nation states, and it takes for granted the rightness and the solidity of a world of nation states. And there's an oddity that during the time when nationalism became established and the world of nation states became established, during this time the world became more and more globalised and connected. And how is this so? It's because, in my view, nationalism and cosmopolitanism or globalisation are deeply entangled. It's not just one thing or the other, they're deeply entangled. And you can see this in today's big cultural events. What is the major cultural event, the biggest cultural event in the world today? It's not the Oscar ceremony. It's certainly not the Eurovision Song Contest or the Nobel Prize winning ceremonies. Who really cares in the world who gets the prize for chemistry or for physics? And it's certainly not Glastonbury. The biggest cultural event in today's world is the Olympic Games, without a doubt. In terms of the global interest, the audiences, the participation, and the financial cost. And this international event of a competition between nations. Individuals cannot compete in the Olympic Games. Cities don't compete. And trade teams don't compete. It's nations. And then you have the ceremony when someone wins. They're draped in a flag, a national flag. And they stand on the podium, and even those who are representing a recently established nation, they know exactly how to behave. They've got to look, they can't keep laughing and smiling and waving. They've got to look into the middle distance, hand on heart, and look and move, especially as the flag is raised, because they're doing it for the nation. And then there's the parades before and after the Olympic Games. National flags, the Olympic flag with its symbols of united circles of continents. And where do the athletes stay? In the Olympic village, as if the world is a village. It's all the time in this entanglement of nationalism and internationalism, the sense of a global world. An Olympic Games would not have been possible before the age of nationalism. You couldn't have an Olympic Games in the medieval period. You actually couldn't have had an Olympic Games as we understand the Olympic Games in ancient Athens. Their Olympic Games weren't like the present Olympic Games. Where were the flags? When I wrote, after I'd written Banal Nationalism, it was criticised by a number of people, theorists, because it really didn't credit the modern world with being a cosmopolitan world. Ulrich Beck, who was a very notable sociologist and social theorist, said that the idea of banal culture was a good idea, but I backed the wrong horse. I should have written about banal cosmopolitanism, because nationalism was on the way out and the world was becoming cosmopolitan. Few would write like that nowadays, after Trump's presidency, after the war in Ukraine. It's as if the world of nationalism was giving way to a world of globalization, and now we see in the modern era deglobalization and the return of nationalism. But that implies that you only have one process, one era at a time. But you first of all had a nationalist era, then you had a globalized era. Now we may be undergoing a deglobalized era. But I don't think this is the case. I think throughout the era of so-called nationalism, globalization was growing because you couldn't have international treaties, you couldn't have international organizations, international embassies, international treaties about fishing and so on, without nation states. One of my favourite plays and films, it appeals to someone of my generation in Britain, is Alan Bennett's play about an old grammar school, boys only of course, called The History Makers, studying history. And there's one character who comes out with a wonderful line. He doesn't like history, he finds it boring, and he says, history is just one fucking thing after another. Wonderful. But it's also untrue. Because history isn't one thing after another. There's never a time in history where it's only one thing. It's often two things together, two contradictory things together. And in one sense, I agree with Ulrich Beck that there's such a thing as methodological nationalism, but we've got overstruck by the idea of the nation state and imagined all societies, or sociologists like Weber imagined all societies, wherever they existed, like mini nation states. And Ulrich Beck, I think, was very good in exposing the simplicity of this assumption. But there's also methodological globalization. We can ask, why do some social theorists think there was an era of globalization and there may still be an era of globalization? Often the evidence comes from economists who say you can have an objective measure of globalization and you can see how globalization has grown, and since 2008 it may have contracted a bit, not contracted and disappeared. The era of deglobalization is also an era of globalization. It's not just one fucking thing, it's after another, it's simultaneous. But how is the economics of globalization, how is it computed? Well, the World Trade Organization has a complex measure, but is based on a simple trace. That you measure globalization by the proportion of the countries of the world's gross domestic product which is imported and exported. And you total these together and you can get an overall measure of globalization in the world. But totting up the economics of globalization involves taking for granted a world divided into nation states. A gross domestic product depends on being the gross domestic product of a particular nation. And the measure of globalization is how much of that gross domestic product has travelled over a national boundary. Not how far it's gone, but whether it's crossed a boundary. For instance, take France, two countries which abut each other, France and Switzerland. The gross domestic product of Switzerland would include products which are sold within Switzerland and sold outside Switzerland. But it's only the latter which counts in the measure of globalization. So, bars of Toblerone made in the old factory in Bern in Switzerland and travel to Paris 300 miles or so, they count as measures of a globalized world. If you take a huge country like Russia, if Vladivostok on the east has products made in St. Petersburg on the west, 6,000 or some miles away. It's chemicals or pharmaceuticals coming from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. It's a big journey, it's part of a trade, but it's not part of globalised trade. So the globalisation measure is itself dependent on their world and nation states and boundaries. You can't have a measure of globalisation as it's measured today if there weren't national boundaries. And it's as if the world of nation states has been taken for granted, as if it's an objective world which must exist. Now, there's one thing which I really don't like about my work on banal nationalism, and where I actually prefer Ulrich Beck's position. And this is that it seems to me that what I wrote about banal nationalism suggests that nationalism has got a grip, a tight grip on today's political imagination, and we can't escape from it. It's a very pessimistic view. Beck's view that we're moving to a new world, which I don't think we are, no one would think that now, is at least has the virtue of being idealistic and forward-looking and full of hope. Now, something happened just a few weeks ago, which made me think, and it reminded me of something which happened 5 years ago. It is one of the advantages of looking at many things in a certain amount of superficiality, that you can make connections. I studied humour. After I studied nationalism, I looked at humour. And one of the great things about humour, one of the great books, was Henri Bergson's book about laughter, and where he said that the comic demands something like a momentary anaesthesia of the heart. Too many people idolise humour, think, oh, it's wonderful, it brings us together in such joy and so on. But humour also can be cruel, involves hardening the heart, even just for a moment, mocking people, mocking ideas, mocking parts of the world, and so on. But even in mocking laughter, there may be a glimmer of hope for the future. 5 years ago, Trump spoke for the first time when he was president at the United Nations. And as is typical of Trump, he started boasting about himself, talking about the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any other administration in the history of our country. And then, I can see someone's laughing already. At the United Nations, you can hear, if you ever play the track, laughter growing and echoing. Bergson said laughter stands in need of an echo, and echoing around the auditorium. And Trump, he demonstrated how his narcissism protects him from all criticism. He didn't get angry, he just smiled and said, I wasn't expecting that. But it's all right, you carry on. was as if he genuinely believed that these foreigners, these other nations, were showing their admiration of him by laughing, as if it was a friendly laugh. And he couldn't just grasp what was going on. Now, I was reminded of this by something which happened just 4 weeks ago. When Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, attended the G20 conference, and there was in India, and there was a spin-off meeting of the representatives of different nations in Delhi, and Lavrov started. He was talking in English. He said, he referred to the war. He said, you know, the war which we are trying to stop and which was launched against us. There was you can hear on the recording a rumble of laughter, which again started growing. A laughter which was spontaneous, which couldn't have been planned in advance. It just happened. And Lavrov looked really serious. He knew he was being laughed at. He knew his country was being laughed at. The ideology of his country was being laughed at. And he carried on firmly talking about the Ukrainians. Now, that incident was politically unimportant. No life was saved. No cessation of a war because people from around the world were laughing at his justification of the war. But maybe, for a brief moment, this brief anesthesia of the heart, which is over almost before it's begun, maybe it was echoing something which we may understand in the future. And such national myths, such dangerous national myths, such violent myths will be laughed at more generally and will be mocked because the era of nationalism will have been past. I don't know whether this is so. I do know that the world as it is will not last. But we can hope. And that cruel laughter, I think, gives hope about human life.
Strict on time, so I suggest we collect a few questions for me. Yeah, if you're happy to answer them, and if you can briefly also, whoever wants to speak, introduce yourself, and maybe you can join me for questions and answers. Yeah, we have the first hand at the back.
Hi, Chris Campbell from the University of Edinburgh. I love your book, obviously. But one thing I've always wanted to ask you is, very simply, who does it? Who puts in place the structures of ideology that create Banal nationalism? Is it an elite force, or is it something from below? And of course, probably a combination of the two, but it's something that's always intrigued me about that particular sense of ideological force that runs through your analysis.
I don't know how to answer that. And I don't know who does it. Once a nation is established, it's quite possible that we all do it. For instance, I looked at newspapers. Newspapers seem top down, but of course newspapers wouldn't exist without their readers. And so you can't have a newspaper which is published without a readership. There are one or two, and I don't know, but as a general answer, I think you'd have to take a specific topic and a specific thing and look at it. Like the flags in the United States, they seem to be everywhere. I don't know.
I have another hand here.
Yes, Soledad Rodriguez from Banal University. Thank you for this very inspiring and interesting talk. You mentioned that nations sort of aim that we define internationalism, sort of aim for a nation state, and I was wondering if you could comment on the cases of nations that are trying to be accommodated within the state. And I'm particularly referring to the experiments in Latin America with plurinational states, such as Bolivia and Ecuador.
Yes. Multinational states run a risk of fragmentation. Sometimes they're a way to stop fragmentation, that the central state will grant national autonomy to various states within or nations within the national state. And it can lead to a tension, or it can solve the problem. For instance, in Canada, more power or more autonomy was granted to Quebec for French nationalism, and that seemed to have stopped a growing movement for actual independence of Quebec. But it's there, it could flare up again. I've been reading something recently about what happened when the Communist Party of the Soviets took over after the 1917 revolution, and they gained support from many of the nations within this multinational or multi-ethnic state of Russia. And Lenin both supported the creation of national Soviets for the various, like Georgia and so on, and he was against it because it weakened the central government. He was torn between the two. And it's significant that when the communist regime collapsed, there was an upsurge of movements for national independence. So I think it's both there.
Manuel Toro from Catholic University of Uruguay. I'm interested in this concept of Banal Internationalism. Do you see a contradiction or something that makes perfect sense? The coexistence of a world that is increasingly diverse, less homogeneous, multicultural, but on the other hand, we are exposed to tell where we're coming from. We have flags in our emoji keyboards, forums with 200 nationals. So is this a contradiction of this reification of national identity, but in a multicultural, less homogeneous world?
I don't think the world is less homogenous. I think there's a general culture going across the world. I think if we go back to the example of the Olympic Games, that implies that the Olympic Games implies that everyone knows how to participate in the Olympic Games. The idea that running around and seeing who can run the fastest might have been absurd to some cultures 300 years ago, or go to the Brazilian rainforest and come across very isolated tribes, and they might find the Olympic Games absurd. So I think the idea that we're becoming more diverse is actually a sign that we're becoming less diverse. But I don't. But again, you will probably know more about this than I do.
John Fernandez from the University of the Basque Country. I wanted to ask you, in places where different nationalisms coexist, I'm thinking of Scotland or the Basque Country itself. Do you think that these two nationalisms can be, both of them, banal, or do you think there's always going to be like a banal nationalism, the hegemonic one, the one of the nation state, and then the other, the secessionist nationalism, is doomed to be perceived as a false nationalism?
Well, first of all, no nationalism is entirely banal. It has its banal moments and it has its banal aspects, but it's likely to catch fire at any moment. You go to the Olympic Games, that is certainly, the nationalism is not banal, although it has its banal aspects. It's the same, I suspect, in both Catalonia and the Basque Country, that there will be some banal things which are just not noticed, which are taken for granted, as well as a politics where it is not, where the nationalism is certainly not banal, but there will be banal moments. Do you think so?
Yes, I agree that there is a banalized form of both nationalisms, although the one which is counter-hegemonic tends to be perceived as positive.
Yes.
But
yes.
In some cases, there can be this, actually.
Yes. And I gather that in Catalonia, the movements which want independence reject the being called nationalist.
And also in the Basque countries, also this trend of rejecting being called nationalist is not so hard, but it's also they start calling themselves pro-independence instead of nationalist.
Yes, but and is it the same for the Basques over the border in France?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to, in some way, throw a spanner in the works and talk about the one nation in the world whose people do have never and do not want to have a nation state, and that's the Russians. For the majority of Russians, and this is the cause of the war in Ukraine, which I'll be talking about this afternoon, for most Russians, Russia, in inverted commas, has never been the Soviet Russian Republic or the current Russian Federation. It's something bigger. And therefore they don't see Russia as that republic as well. So how would you talk about that kind of national? I mean, one political scientist, Alexander Mokl, about 30 years ago said Russian nationalism is a myth because Russians have never desired a nation state, so it's wrong to even call it nationalism. How would you talk about that kind of nationalism?
Well, empires are very different, and empires can involve whole lots of populations which have their own sense of identity, but also see themselves as part of the empire. But there again, those on the fringes of the empire are potentially secessionists. Like if you take the example of the British Empire, it's not just that the British Empire was in other parts of the world. The Irish in Ireland didn't want to be part of the British Empire or the British state. And I suspect that in Russia at the moment, there are tensions between part of Russia and what they want to, how they interpret Russia, and that there are parts of Russia where there is a strong feeling that the Russian state must not be built around the idea of the Russian people. But that is different from saying there mustn't be a Russian state. It's an argument within the state. And you certainly don't want to say that those philosophers of the nation who Putin has admired and who see Ukraine as an essential part of Russia, to say, oh, they're not nationalists.
So one other hand over there.
I'm Scott Childress from the State University of New York. As you're talking and you mentioned Tajfel, I'm thinking of the possibility of active banal nationalism. Tajfel talked a lot about what happens when you divide into two groups and become antagonistic. So some recent social psychology work suggests when there are three groups or more, they actually aim more toward a kind of working together as opposed to being antagonistic. And so you mentioned the United States, where the flying of the flag is actually a very assertive act by certain people and making certain claims of the American nation. And I'm wondering about the possibility that the third way of people who are trying to create a different aspect of nationalism that wouldn't be that assertive kind, but also the kind that actually rejects the flag.
Yeah, I'd like to see it in operation. That's very interesting. I must admit I haven't kept up with the recent developments of social identity. Yes, you will know more about this than me. And so it shouldn't be a question to me, because I'll just speak from your experience. So there's the possibility of a third way. When you've got three groups.
Yeah, because you've got the Republicans, conservatives who fly the flag and mean saying this country's ours.
Yeah.
And then you've got liberals, Democrats who then will say the country's ours, but we refuse to fly the flag because that has been taken over by you. And so it's a kind of.
But they don't. The Democrats take the Democratic conventions for electing. They're awash with flags.
They are, but I'm talking about in daily life. I mean, in the town I live in, for example, no Democrat flies the flag. It's only Republicans. And so in daily life, the flag has a very assertive meaning. I see what you're saying, that realm of politics. But in daily life, and my son, for example, will never pull for the United States in the World Cup. He's going to pull for Portugal or anybody, but not the United States. So there's kind of a negative. Liberals and Democrats on the street have a kind of negative nationalism.
And in the schools, do they still have to salute the flag and hand on heart every morning?
They do, but they're rolling their eyes when they do.
Yes. That's a good sign.
Right, we might have time for one last very quick question. Jonathan?
I'm Jonathan Harrington, Bishop Edinburgh, President of the ASEN Issue. Something about a slightly different interpretation of the mocking laughter, which you offered at the end as a kind of way out of the world of nationalism. Because it would seem to me that what's actually happening in the cases of Trump and Huckabee is representatives of the community of nations are disciplining somebody for behaving outside of the norms of that community. So the mocking laughter could also be interpreted as very much an assertion of that community of nations and its norms of behavior.
No, I absolutely, utterly agree. What I was doing wasn't interpreting why they've laughed, but trying to pin some hope on the fact that they've laughed. That's all. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. But that is the limitations of good analysis.
There was a couple of other hands I saw at the end, but so maybe a quick one if it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Promise from University of Cambridge. So my question is about the distinction between banal nationalism and everyday nationalism. Do you think that is a useful distinction, or just a distinction without a difference?
I know some people have written about this. I haven't read their work properly. I really would suggest that you probably are better informed than I am about this. And if I try and say anything, it would I'd make errors. But one thing which I will say is, because I've used the word banal nationalism, I'm not going to defend it.
Thank you, Meg. I suggest you might talk maybe to Marko Tosic, who is one of the authors who wrote quite extensively about everyday nationalism,
yes,
perhaps, while you're at the conference. Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I know there's more questions, but I'm sure we will be still here, so you can take conversations over coffee in a formal manner. We have a little bit more than 5 minutes to transfer into the different panel rooms now. But before we do, I hope, well, first of all, that we go back to a reference you started with, actually. So Professor Billig started the talk by mentioning this distinction between two types of academics, like earlier, as I have earlier